All right, welcome back from the short break. So now we're very happy to have Matias to present the asymmetric pass-through of sovereign risk.
Okay, thank you very much, Wenxin. I'm very happy to be presenting here today. I was on the market this year. I'm a PhD candidate from New York University. I will be joining Princeton as a postdoc for the next academic year. And then in 2022, I will start working at the World Bank in the research department. So let me start with the introduction of my paper. Let me start first saying this, that sovereign debt crises are characterized by very large and persistent declines in economic activity. So think about, for example, Italy or Spain during the last European debt crisis. It took those countries about 7 to 8 years to fully recover. The question, of course, is why are these crises so large and so persistent? A common explanation that you typically find in the literature is based on the exposure of domestic banks to sovereign risk. And the idea underlying all these papers is that banks typically hold a very large amount of government bonds. And because of that, whenever there is an increase in sovereign risk, that will weaken the balance sheet of the domestic banks and will tighten the supply of credit, which of course will propagate the effect to the rest of the real economy. Now, what I show in this paper is that that explanation is missing a very important piece, and that is corporate risk. So what I show is that sovereign debt crises are characterized not only by large increases in sovereign risk, but also by very large increases in corporate risk. And also, and this is my contribution to this literature, what I find is that there are very important heterogeneous effects here. So for example, the riskier firms, those with higher default probability, are significantly more affected during a sovereign debt crisis. Now, the key issue here, of course, is that the domestic banks are typically heavily exposed to corporate risk. So for the European countries, as an average, their exposure, the exposure of the banks is around 4 to 5 times larger in terms of exposure to corporate risk relative to exposure to sovereign risk. So this increase in corporate risk will have a significant impact and an effect on the balance sheet of these domestic banks and will amplify, in a sense, the contraction in the credit supply. So the goal of this paper is to study and quantify the importance of corporate risk as an amplification mechanism of sovereign debt crisis. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to formulate heterogeneous firms model with aggregate uncertainty. So you can think of this as a closed economy in which there are three main sectors. So you have the domestic banks, the firms, and the government. The idea is that the banks are going to provide long-term loans to the firms, and also they're holding at the same time government bonds. The firms are going to take loans in order to finance their investment, but those loans are risky because these firms can endogenously optimally default in the model. At the same time, the government debt is also risky, and for simplicity here, I'm going to assume that the government debt is subject to an exogenous sovereign risk type of process. Now, I will describe that there are two different links through which corporate risk is linked to sovereign risk in my model. So I have what I call the bank lending channel, which is completely endogenous in my model. And I also have an exogenous channel, which I'm calling a productivity type of channel. So this is kind of like the idea of the whole paper. Suppose that there is an increase in sovereign risk. Banks are heavily exposed to that type of risk. So this will have an effect on the net worth of the bank. The bank lending capacity will be affected. They are going to reduce the credit supply, or they're going to charge higher spreads. Now, in this context, firms are going to have more incentives to default. That will increase the average level of corporate risk in the economy. So that is what I call the bank lending channel. Now, on top of this, of course, this is only one channel. You may think, well, there are many channels through which sovereign risk could have an impact on corporate risk. So for example, there may be a trade type of channel or a fiscal channel that has been already discussed and analyzed in the literature. So all those channels are going to be captured in a reduced form type of way through lower productivity of the firms upon a sovereign default. So the idea is that if the government defaults, the productivity of the firm will be lower in that case. So that is this direct link that you have here. So what I'm going to do in this paper, in my empirical analysis, I'm going to estimate this transmission going from sovereign to corporate risk. That is the full effect. I'm going to use that to calibrate this quantitative model. And then what I'm going to do is to use that model to try to understand and quantify the importance of this feedback loop, meaning the impact of this increase in corporate risk on the net worth of the bank and on bank's credit supply. Okay, so in terms of the results, what I'm going to do in my empirical analysis, I'm using Italian firm level data for the 2010-2012 period during the last European debt crisis in order to estimate this transmission going from sovereign to corporate risk. In terms of the identification strategy, what I do is to exploit changes in the volatility of Italian sovereign risk around a set of what I'm calling 40 news events. Those events are essentially news from other European countries. What I find in the paper, and this is of course in the ballpark of previous estimates in the literature, is that sovereign risk can account for almost 30% of the total increase in corporate risk. But on top of that, and this is my contribution here, I describe very important heterogeneous effects or an important asymmetric transmission of sovereign risk. In particular, what I show is that those firms with higher pre-crisis levels of corporate risk, so the riskier firms, those are the ones that are significantly more affected by an increase in sovereign risk. So once I do that, then I'm going to use those estimates to calibrate this model that I was talking about in order to study the importance of this feedback loop. And what I show in the paper, and this is my main result, is that this feedback loop right here you have in red can account for about 20% of the decline in GDP. And on top of that, my model also is able to capture this asymmetric transmission of sovereign risk. So I'm going to use that model. I'm going to exploit that heterogeneity that I have in the model in order to provide some policy analysis.
A quick clarifying question. Are you
Yes.
going to address the missing loop from the corporate back to the sovereign?
No, no. In the model, and I will be more clear about this, for simplicity, I'm assuming that sovereign risk is completely exogenous. So everything goes from left to right, but there is not going to be another feedback loop from the corporate to the sovereign. Okay, so let me give you more details about the model that I'm considering. So here you have this economy, as I said, think of this as a closed economy. There are four main sectors. So of course you have the government, the domestic banks, the households, and the non-financial firms, which are heterogeneous. And the idea here is that the banks are going to provide all the credit in this economy. They are going to hold government bonds, which are long-term, and they're going to provide long-term loans to the non-financial firms. The thing is that these banks are going to be subject to some financial constraints, in particular a leverage constraint, that will limit the ability of the banks to provide credit to the non-financial firms. So here you can see the two channels through which sovereign risk will impact the real economy. This one that you have right here, this is what I call the bank lending channel, which is the endogenous channel that I have in the model. The idea is the one that I was referring before. Banks are, of course, holding government bonds. So if there is an increase in sovereign risk, the net worth of the bank will be affected. And because banks are subject to this leverage constraint in my model, they will need to reduce the supply of credit to the extent that that leverage constraint is binding. They're going to charge higher spreads. That will have an impact on the loans. And of course, it will have an impact on the corporate risk of these non-financial firms. On top of that channel, I also have this direct type of link, which is exogenous in my model and acts through lowers firm productivity upon a sovereign default. And I'm going to use that extra layer in the model to have more flexibility so that I'm able to match the empirical estimates that I have for my analysis. Okay, and the goal here is to try to understand and quantify this two-way feedback loop between the balance sheets of the banks and corporate risk. Okay, so let me start describing all the different pieces of the model. Let's start with the non-financial firms. So these firms are going to be heterogeneous across three main dimensions. Of course, in terms of capital or the size of the firm, in terms of the stock of long-term loans, B, and also in terms of their productivity, which I'm assuming that follows a AR1 type of process. Okay, so these firms, what they're going to do is to use their own stock of capital K. They're going to hire labor in the market L to produce the unique final good of this economy, which is this Y right here. using this Cobb-Douglas type of technology. And notice that the productivity of the firm, it depends on the idiosyncratic productivity, but it also depends on this psi variable in blue, which captures aggregate productivity losses in the event of a sovereign default. So the idea is that this variable psi, it is normalized to 1 if the government is not in a default today, but it takes a value smaller than 1 if the government is in a default today. And I will use this extra layer of flexibility basically to exogenously link corporate risk to sovereign risk. Okay.
We have a quick question.
Yes,
So
of course.
one audience is wondering the economic intuition to explain the drop in firm productivity after the sovereign default.
Yeah. For example, you might think of that as a trade type of channel. So for example, if the government defaults, other countries may impose some trade sanctions, okay? So the firms will have more difficulties in exporting their goods, or they may also have difficulties in importing some inputs that they need for production, and that decreases the productivity of the firm. And you may also think of this kind of like a fiscal channel to the extent that the government defaults today. That government will not be able to borrow more from lenders in that context, so probably they will have to raise some taxes in the event of the default, and that is going to decrease the profits of the firm. Okay, so all of that is captured in this very reduced form type of way. Okay, so this is the recursive problem of the firm. B, of course, the value function. K, B, and C are the 3 idiosyncratic states, and this capital S is the aggregate state of the economy. So the firm is risk neutral, and what it's going to do is to choose their optimal next period stock of loans and their optimal next period stock of capital to maximize the sum of current dividends D plus the expected continuation value. And this is a model with limited commitment, meaning that this firm can default, okay? So that default decision will basically depend on 2 things: on the continuation value of the firm of keep operating, and on this exit value of the firm, which is captured by this exogenous function VD, okay? So to the extent that this first term is higher than the second one, the firm will not default today. Now, dividends are given by the sum of current profits, pi, minus the investment cost of this particular firm, plus what you have here are the proceeds from issuing new loans, okay? So this Q is an endogenous object in the model, and it essentially depends on 2 things. It depends, of course, on the probability of default of the firm, okay? And it also depends on whatever is happening with the balance sheets of the bank, okay? Because this, at the end of the day, is a function of the stochastic discount factor of the domestic balance of the model, okay? And the last term that you have here are just the debt services. So this is whatever this firm has to repay in terms of coupons, okay? Those are CF, and also in terms of the loans that are maturing today. And those are captured by this MF parameter, okay? Now I'm imposing a non-negative dividend constraint that is purely for simplicity. It's not a critical assumption. And this is just to avoid modeling the equity issuance problem of the firm. And the last equation that you have here is just the perceived law of motion for all the aggregates of the economy, okay, including the distribution of the firms. Okay, the household size of the economy is going to be very, very simple. These are going to be risk neutral agents, okay? They are the owners of the banks. They consume the unique final good. They also work, and they can save, but they only have one instrument available, and those are short-term deposits, okay? X. Let me skip this recursive problem, and let's jump directly to the government side of the economy. So the idea is that the government will issue long-term bonds, B, to satisfy its budget constraint, okay? So think that there is on the background kind of like an exogenous fiscal rule for this government. The thing is that the price of those bonds, which are denoted with this QBS, depends again on 2 different things. It depends on the default probability of the government captured by the sovereign risk, and also depends on the stochastic discount factor of the bank, because those are the ones that are providing the credit, okay? Now, this government problem is completely exogenous in my model. This follows the Bocola 2016 paper. And the idea is that every single period, there is the realization of this default shock, okay? So H prime G can take two values, 0 or 1. If it is 1, it means that the government will default today. And notice that this depends on two additional things. It depends on this epsilon prime H shock, which is just an AID shock. And it also depends on the level of this S variable. And I'm going to interpret that S as a sovereign risk, because the larger the value or the level of that variable S, then the more likely that for whatever realization of this epsilon prime shock that you have today, the government will default, okay? So that is completely exogenous in the model. And for simplicity, this sovereign risk process is going to follow this very simple AR1 process that you have here. And that is the only source of aggregate uncertainty in the model, okay? So that is going to be the unique aggregate shock that I have in the model. Okay, to close the economy, I need to define what is happening with the domestic banks, okay? So remember, the banks are owned by the household, okay? And the goal here is to maximize the expected net worth eta upon exit. So this is essentially following Gerler and Karadi type of model. So W is the valuation of the bank. And each period, a banker is going to choose the optimal allocation between government bonds, B prime, the optimal allocation between loans to each of the firms in the model, and also the optimal allocation of deposits, X prime, to maximize this expression right here, which is the expected net worth of this bank upon exit, okay? So every single period, there is kind of like an exogenous probability sign that the bank will exit the economy. Now, the constraints that I have here are the following. The first one that you have here is just the definition of the balance sheet of the bank, okay? So on the left-hand side, what you have is the sum of the deposits and the net worth of the bank. On the right-hand side, what you have is the market value of the assets of the bank. So here's the sum of the market value of the loans to all the firms that you have in the model, plus the market value of the stock of government bonds that this bank is holding. Now, the second constraint is what I call the incentive constraint or the leverage constraint. And this is saying that a fraction kappa of the assets of the bank cannot be larger than the valuation of the bank. And this is the key equation that I have in the model, because this equation allows me to endogenously link sovereign risk to corporate risk through the bank, through the domestic banks of the economy. So this is kind of like the intuition of what is happening here. So suppose that for some reason there is an increase in sovereign risk, okay? Now in that context, banks are exposed to that risk, so there will be a reduction in the net worth of the bank. So this W will decrease. Now, to the extent that this incentive constraint is binding, the bank will have to readjust their portfolio allocation between loans to the firms and the stock of government bonds that they're going to hold, okay? So what they're going to do is to reduce the credit supply, and they're going to charge higher spreads. Now, in that context, firms will find more difficulties in order to roll over their debt, okay? So the incentives to default, which are endogenous in my model, will increase, and that will increase, of course, corporate risk from an aggregate perspective, okay? The last two equations are just law of motions. This is the law of motion for next period net worth of this banker, and the last equation is the perceived law of motion for all the aggregates of the economy. Okay, so let me summarize so far what I have said. So I formulated a model in which corporate risk is linked to sovereign risk in two different ways. You have this productivity channel, which is exogenous, and the idea is that if the government defaults, the productivity of the firm will decrease. And you also have this bank lending channel, which is completely endogenous, okay? And this bank lending channel, at the end of the day, is a function of two main things. It depends on how much the net worth of the bank changes after a change in sovereign risk. And it also depends on how sensitive this pricing kernel of the firm is to changes in the net worth of the bank, okay? So what I'm going to do next, this is the next step, I'm going to use Italian data in order to estimate this transmission from sovereign to corporate risk. And I'm going to estimate the full effect, meaning both the bank lending channel and also this type of reduced form channel that I have. And I'm going to use those estimates to calibrate my model, okay? So let me jump directly to the empirical analysis unless there is a question. Okay, so the first, as I said, I'm going to use Italy as a case of a study during the last European debt crisis, okay? And the first thing that I need to do is to construct a measure of corporate risk. And you will see, because of the type of high frequency identification strategy that I'm going to follow, I need to rely or to construct a high frequency measure of corporate risk, okay? And for that reason, I'm going to use the Merton's framework, okay? Because essentially uses daily stock prices in order to compute a risk neutral default probability. So I have data for 120 non-financial Italian firms that are publicly traded, and I'm going to use that data to compute an aggregate or an average measure of corporate risk for Italy, okay? And that is what you have in this red line. That is my measure of corporate risk. Now, the black line.
Clarifying question:
Yes, of course.
Why can't you use corporate CDS?
Yes, I can, of course. The advantage of using this is that I can have a larger pool of of firms in my sample. You know, the firms that are issuing CDS are typically the largest firms in the economy. Now, if you follow this type of approach, you can also include smaller firms that only issue equity or stocks.
And a follow-up question, right? I didn't follow this comparison closely for Italy, obviously. So the sovereign, like, it's not always the case that the sovereign risk is lower than the corporate risk for Italy. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, here you can see that the corporate risk is a little bit higher than the Italian sovereign risk. And this is something that you can also observe, I think, in Spain and in other GIBS countries during this particular period of time. Now, the important thing that I want to mention here is this positive correlation between the two measures, okay? So notice that as the crisis unfolds in 2010, there is a very large increase in both sovereign and corporate risk, okay? Now, on top of this aggregate measure of corporate risk, there is a very large heterogeneity across these non-financial firms. And that is something that you can observe in this figure right here. So what you have here is the exact same measure of corporate risk, but the black line now shows the median level across these 120 firms that I have in my sample. And the gray area shows the interquartile range. So as you can see, as the crisis develops, there is not only an increase in the median level of corporate risk, but there is also a very large increase in the dispersion of this risk, okay? So this heterogeneous reaction or this asymmetric transmission will be a central element you will see in my empirical analysis and also in my quantitative analysis, okay? So keep that in mind. Okay. So in terms of the identification strategy, remember, the goal here is to estimate this effect going from sovereign to corporate risk. There are obvious challenges if you want to do that. One, for example, is causality, because it may have been the case, and this is following, for instance, Steve's paper, that first there was something happening with corporate risk, and that affected the sovereign risk of the Italian economy. And there may also be some common factors, okay? So in terms of the identification strategy, what I'm going to do is to rely on a set of what I'm calling foreign news events that will allow me to capture exogenous variation in Italian sovereign risk. So these news are coming from two other European countries, Greece and Portugal, and they involve news about credit rating downgrade for these two other economies, and also news about bailouts, okay? So I have a set of around 30 events between the 3 years of the crisis, 2010, 2011, and 2012. So the question is, okay, I have those events. How am I going to use those events in order to identify this transmission for the Italian economy? What I'm doing is to follow this heterogeneity-based type of approach. And the idea is that I'm going to exploit differences in the volatility of Italian sovereign risk around these foreign news events. So this approach was first developed by Rigoban and Sack, but it has also been used in this sovereign debt type of literature. For example, this paper by Heber and Traeger, And also it's widely used in the monetary policy type of literature. As an example, you have this Nakamura and Stinson paper in 2018. So let me very, very briefly try to describe what this approach is all about, okay? So let's consider the following system of equations, okay, in which the change in Italian corporate risk is a linear function of changes in Italian sovereign risk, a function of potential and observed common factors captured by this xt vector, and also a shock epsilon t, okay? And then the same applies to sovereign risk. In this case, the change in Italian sovereign risk is a function of corporate risk, some common factors, and some shocks. So what I'm going to do is to split all the days that I have in my sample between event and non-event days based on these foreign news events. And the formal identifying assumption here is that the variance of this eta shock, meaning the shock to changes in Italian sovereign risk, is significantly higher during this news, but the variances of both shocks to Italian corporate risk and also common factors remain the same, okay? Let me please skip the details to save a little bit of time, but I do provide evidence that backs up that type of assumptions, okay? But the whole idea of this approach is to use this information in the second order moments in order to be able to estimate my coefficient of interest, which is this alpha 1 parameter. Okay, so let me jump directly to the results. So what you have here are both the IV estimate based on this Rigobon and SAC type of approach, and also the OLS estimate for different specifications of the model. So let's focus on this column that is highlighted in gray. This is saying that a 1 percentage point increase in Italian sovereign risk leads to almost 30 basis point increase in Italian corporate risk, okay? And that more or less is capturing about 30% of the total increase in corporate risk that we observed during this European debt crisis in Italy, okay? So the idea is that I'm going to use this estimate in order to calibrate my quantitative model. Now, this is the full effect, okay? And behind this value of 0.29, there are many channels that may be explained in this number, okay? So there is the bank lending channel, a trade channel, a fiscal channel, and so on. So what I do in the paper, but this is going to be outside of today's presentation, is I study and provide evidence that highlights the importance of banks behind this transmission, okay? And what I show is that banks do explain an important amount of this particular number that you have here, okay?
You have about 3 minutes.
Say again, sorry?
You have about 3 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll open floor for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of the results that I have, here you have the same IV, but for firms with the different levels of risk before the crisis, okay? So here you have, when you include all the firms in the sample, okay? And to the right of this red line, you have the same IV, but for a finer decomposition. So you have firms sorted from the safest all the way to the riskiest, okay? And as you can see, the safer firms are almost unaffected by this increase in sovereign risk, but then you have these riskier firms which are significantly more affected by the presence of sovereign risk. Okay, so let me jump directly to the quantitative analysis. What I do is to use those estimates to calibrate my model. Okay, and the idea is that I'm going to use this XID variable, which remember is the exogenous drop in productivity, in order to be able to match this transmission going from sovereign to corporate risk that I just described in the data. Okay, so first of all, let me show you that the model can replicate really nice the Italian crisis. So what I do here is to fit the model with a sequence of sovereign risk that resembles the one that you observe in Italy. And the model does a good job in matching both the size of the crisis and also the persistence, as you can see here. It matches well the increase in leverage, in banks leverage, and the posterior decline. And it also does a good job, and this is sort of targeted in the calibration, in matching this increase in corporate risk or the increase in the default rate in the model, okay? Now, if you have to remember something from today's presentation is this graph. what you have here is the same IV estimates that I showed you before in the data. Those are in black. And you have the model implied estimates. Those are in red, okay? So when I include all the firms, this is the point estimate that you have here. That is a targeted moment in my calibration. But the model is also able to match this asymmetric transmission of sovereign risk. And this is completely untargeted in my calibration, okay? So as in the data, you have these safer firms, which are almost unaffected by sovereign risk, but then you have this smaller sample of riskier firms who are significantly affected by corporate risk, by sovereign risk, okay? So let me conclude with this. The question is, okay, how relevant is this increase in corporate risk during sovereign debt crisis as an amplification mechanism? What I show in the paper by means of different counterfactuals is that the contraction in the credit supply due to sovereign risk alone can only account for a small fraction of the crisis, okay? But that is consistent with the previous quantitative literature. Now, if you include in the model corporate risk, I do get a much larger drop in aggregate output, okay? And what I show is that the bank lending channel, which remember is my endogenous mechanism, can account for about 40% of the total decline that you observe in GDP. And from that 40%, corporate risk is explaining almost half of that effect, okay? And on top of that, because of this asymmetric transmission of sovereign risk, the riskier firms are the ones to blame here, okay? Those are the ones that are explaining this extra decrease in output due to the increase in corporate risk, okay? Because those are the ones who observe very large increases in corporate risk, and those are the ones that are significantly affecting the balance sheet of the domestic banks, okay? And let me conclude in one more minute with the fiscal policies that I analyze in the paper. So the idea and the question here is, okay, can we exploit this asymmetric transmission of sovereign risk to provide some policy guidance? So what I do is to consider 4 different fiscal policies, and they all have the exact same fiscal cost. So the first policy is just a debt relief to all the firms in the economy. The second one is a debt relief only to the riskier firms, so firms with a default probability higher than a certain threshold. The last 2 are policies that are helping directly the banks. So number 3 is a policy in which the government is repaying all the non-performing loans. The last one is just a direct capital injection to the domestic banks. So what I show in the paper is that actually the policy in which you are helping directly the riskier firms, so policy number 2, displays important efficiency gains, okay? So what is the intuition of this result? There are essentially, with this policy, you can achieve 2 different goals at the very same time. On the one hand, because you are helping those firms that are closer to the default boundary, you are decreasing the level of corporate defaults that you experience in the simulations. Now, at the same time, because the number of defaults is lower in this case, you are actually reducing corporate risk in the economy. You're reducing the overall level of corporate risk. And that allows you to indirectly recapitalize the domestic banks, which of course is going to benefit all the firms in the economy through a higher or larger credit supply.
Great. All right. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Okay,
I
thank
guess,
you very much.
let's
Let's
leave
finish
the
there.
conclusion slide there. We can open the floor for Q&A. So people can raise hands and or just type in the chat box. I will start with one short question. So in this bank lending channel, right, you need the banks to hold this risky corporate debt, right? Whereas in practice, we know banks do not necessarily hold the risky debt, whereas they do hold the sovereigns assumed to be risk-free. So that would weaken the channel, right?
Yes, to some extent that may be true, but also you may think that the type of incentive constraint that I'm assuming, for example, right here, this kappa, which is basically how exposed you are to this type of risk, both for the corporate and for the sovereign, that may be also different in real life. Here I'm just imposing a constant kappa across the 2 types of assets, but in reality, the kappa that is affecting these corporate loans may also be different to the kappa affecting these government bonds, and that may, in a sense, amplify the results that I'm presenting today. So I think that the result at the end is not very clear which effect will be higher in my model or what you have in mind.
Great. Now we have Dario asking a question.
Hi, hello. Thank you for the nice presentation. So I'm Italian, I'll start with that.
Yeah.
And I find this very interesting because I was there in Italy when this crisis erupted at first. Now, my take on this, and I'm not sure how you're going from the model to the empirics, as far as I can tell, is that a huge portion of what you call risk is really non-performing loans. That's the real burden for Italian banks. I don't know whether you captured that in your risk measure, and I was not sure about the model either. And one important thing about non-performing loans that came to my mind is actually reverse causality. So the extent to which banks can actually extend credit to these banks also make them more to these firms also make them more risky. So at some point there was almost a reverse causality, an endogenous way in which the market reacted, where firms were endogenously made more risky because banks could basically could not finance them in that sense. And I have also a question about the last part, since you were mentioning Italy in 2012, which is a very tough period in terms of austerity and fiscal measures. Have you considered the potential hypothetical effect of removing the austerity measures that were imposed and the budget surpluses that were imposed, which effectively worked as a fiscal reevaluation? Thank you.
Okay.
It was very interesting.
Thank you, Dario. Excellent questions. So let me start with your first question regarding non-performing loans. So in the model, there are two things going on, okay? So because these are long-term loans, you have changes in corporate risk are driven not only because more firms are defaulting, which those are the non-performing loans that you are thinking of, but also because the fact that you may default in the future with a higher probability, that will have an impact on the price of the loan, and that will have an impact on the net worth of the bank, okay? So those two things are in fact captured in my quantitative model. So I am able to say something about how important are the non-performing loans or the default rates, and how important is the change in the pricing of those loans just because a higher default probability in the future. Now, in terms of the reverse causality, that is also captured in the model, okay? So, and that is something that you can observe also in this equation in the incentive constraint. So now, suppose now that you have this increase in sovereign risk, the economy is in a recession now. Now the model will deliver an increase in corporate risk, okay? And that will affect the valuation of the bank, okay? So this W will be affected, that will have an effect on the leverage constraint of the bank. So the bank will have to restrict its credit supply even more than before, and that will also have an impact or an effect on the non-performing loans, okay? So the model does in fact capture this reverse causality that you're thinking, that the increase in non-performing loans is what is driving this extra increase in corporate risk. So that is captured. And lastly, regarding the fiscal measures, I haven't so far analyzed what happens if you impose, for example, an austerity package. And the thing is that in my model, sovereign risk is completely exogenous, okay? So the model will not say anything at all regarding the impact of an austerity package on the default probability of the government. That is completely outside the scope of this paper. So I think that those type of policies that you may be thinking of are not ideal to answer with this type of model.
Great, thanks so much. We have one last question from Jesse.
So excellent paper. I really enjoyed this. So I had a question about and a suggestion about the Rigobone estimator. It seems like you are implicitly, your exclusion restriction is effectively that these shocks are only affecting corporate risk through their effect on sovereign spreads. And so the fact that the OLS and the IV are close together means most of it is usually in that direction. Yeah. And what would be kind of really helpful to see is you could imagine running this exact regression, but if you put something like German firms' credit spreads on the left-hand side, you might see, you might be able to see, like kind of direct evidence for, oh, perfect.
Right here, Jesse. I didn't have the time to go through this, but you have it here. Here you have the case of Italy, The case of Spain, not surprisingly, the OLS and IV are positive and significant. Now, for these 4 other European countries, the OLS is significant, which it may be saying that there are some common factors here at play, but the fact that the IV is essentially 0, it is, again, backing up this identifying assumption that the volatility of those common factors are not being affected by the news that I'm using to identify all the effects.
And is the left-hand side in all of these the Italian CDS, or is it country by country CDS?
No.
Sorry, the right-hand side.
The right-hand side, I'm always using the Italian CDS because,
okay.
German
Never mind
CDS
that
are not
question.
going to change at all.
This is really nice.
Okay.